Hi everyone, I'm Robyn Weldon. I am an artist and an art and photography teacher at a school in Truro in Cornwall, and I'm absolutely delighted to be able to contribute this video tutorial for the Eat Craft Smile Festival, which is raising money for the Trussell Trust. Now, this is only going to be a short video basically outlining the sorts of materials that I use in order to produce my oil paintings, and just to give you a bit of information really on how you can work with the oil paints and different mark making techniques, and a little bit about my working process. So I'm in my humble studio and I have all of my equipment with me. I am at the moment exploring working with acrylic pad paper. So it's like a canvas paper, but I've also painted on boards, on canvas, and also just normal cartridge paper as well. Whereas this is slightly thicker, and it's quite experimental for me to be working with this material after working with just regular cartridge for so long. I've also got my oil paints on my trusty bit of cardboard. I always like using cardboard so that at the end of my painting sessions I can just throw the cardboard in the bin and I don't have to be washing palettes and things like that, but that's just a personal preference. The paints that I'll be using today are Winsor & Newton oil paints. I really love working with oil paints for lots of reasons, but mainly because there's just so much you can do with them in terms of mark making, and they don't dry as quickly as, say, acrylic paint or watercolour. The other thing that I use all of the time is Artist White Spirit, and I use this to wash my brushes, but also sometimes to thin paint out as well on my canvas or paper. And I also use the Dahlia and Rowney oil medium as well to thin paint out and to sometimes create a bit of a varnish on top of the finished painting as well. Now, it's really important that you use a variety of materials to put the paint onto your canvas or onto your paper. I have hundreds of brushes. I use so many different sized brushes all of the time, but I also like to use my palette knife. This is my favourite palette knife out of all of them that I have. I always seem to use this one the most. And I've also just got a normal decorator's brush. Can be quite nice to spread areas of the paint over a larger space at the same time. And then just my normal smaller brushes too. Now, what you can do if you're wanting to just start off working small is mark off on any piece of paper or card or board that you're painting on the space that you want to paint in. Now, I've got quite a big piece of cartridge here, and I'm just going to make it a little bit smaller. Of course, you can cut it down to begin with if you want to, but I always like to leave a bit of a border, and then if I'm happy with the work at the end, then I'll trim it on the guillotine. So masking tape is really useful to have. Most people have that lying around at home as well. And of course, you can make sure that you're working to a set dimension every time. If you're someone that likes to be very particular, I tend to just go with the flow and see how I feel on the day. So I've got my masking tape down, and what I always start off with is producing a background to any painting, and it's always really important that I work from my own photographs that I've taken of the ocean, of the horizon line, of the beach, any landscape. It's always important to work from an image, if not from real life. I prefer to work in the studio, and so I take lots of pictures and then bring them back to the studio and work from them directly in the studio space. You can also, of course, take videos and things when you're out and about and you're walking, and take inspiration from those, and of course from other artists' work too. I prefer to take inspiration from my own experiences, and I have lots of pictures in front of me here on my studio wall that I'm going to be taking inspiration from. Yesterday I had a visit to Penrose National Trust and took some beautiful pictures of the water down there, so that's going to be inspiring this painting today. Now, to begin with, as I said, you need to start off with your background, and so what I tend to do is I work with a bigger brush These brushes are quite stiff, and better to work with the oil paints over softer brushes. And I'll always just make sure that the brush is wet, either with the oil or with the white spirit to begin with. And to produce my background, I want a thin layer of paint. I don't want too much paint on my background. So what I'll always do is I'll go for the key colours that I always turn to all of the time. So we've got the Prussian blue, and also the white paint, the white oil paint, and I've also got some green and a little bit of pink as well. Sometimes it's appearing in my work at the moment. And what I will do always is I'll recall the colours I've seen, I'll look at my pictures in front of me, and I'll take the inspiration from those colours that I'm seeing. And what I will do is I'll use the oil to the medium to thin down my paint, and I won't think too much about how I am applying the background, because this is essentially just to get rid of the white. It's very thin, so I will use the oil, the thinning medium, quite a lot, and I will just spread the paint mostly horizontally, but a lot of lines do appear in my work as well. And without washing my brush, I always seem to not wash my brush as often as I should, but I like the mixes that you get. I'll then start adding a little bit of white over the top of that. It was very moody yesterday where I went, and there was a lot of wind and rain as well, actually, in the distance. And what you'll notice now is I'm starting to use my brush in different directions. So although I'm just doing a background layer, some parts of the background are going to be thicker than others. And I'm just going to keep working into it over and over again with the brush to get this really sort of this blue moody depth to the background. And it's quite thin in some areas. Okay, hopefully you can see that. Now, what I want to do next is where I see the horizon, is I want to sort of just bear in mind where the horizon line is going to be. I'm not going to paint the horizon line in straight away. This is just the background. So I might then start working from the bottom of the painting up. I will wash my brush this time because I'm going to use a totally different colour from what I'm normally used to. And I always have as well kitchen paper in my studio and flannels, face cloths, just normal flannels, and sometimes they're really good to just wipe your brush on, or any excess paint as well, and then they can either be washed or put in the bin, etc. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to mix a little bit of white with it's like an ochre, I think is how you pronounce it, and I'm going to be going from the bottom of the painting up now, and you can probably imagine that this is going to be representing the land in the landscape. Now, the background is often very muted, the tones are very muted, the colours are not as bold or as vibrant as you will see in the finished painting, but already I'm starting to think about my diagonal lines in the work, because a lot of my work has a lot of diagonal lines, if you're familiar with it. And I'm just going to get a little bit of darker paint as well and include that in this landscape. And it's just trial and error with adding the paint where the colours work well together. But I always really insist in my classes at school, and whenever I'm talking to anyone about painting or running a workshop, that you must always work from a picture. That's really important. And of course there's lots of artists that work from inside their head, and that's fine, that works for them. But personally for me, it really helps when painting a landscape that I have the landscape in front of me, either for real or with a picture, a photograph that I've taken. Now, I'm sort of getting to the point where hopefully you can see where the land is going to be meeting the water's edge. And what I often do is I cross these two areas over. So there's still no beginning and end to the water, to the sky, or to the land itself in the painting. They're starting to mix, they're blending together. And then what I'll do next is I'll start to introduce another colour. So this is where we're at so far, okay? You can see that we've got those diagonal lines which often appear in my work, and we're starting to get a range of colours in here now as well. So I'm going to start introducing a green, and I'm really enjoying using green at the moment and bringing in these sort of minty colours into the work. And I'm still not committing to deciding where the horizon line is going to be in the work yet. I'm just going to continue to fill the white space in, and notice that I'm still using my oil medium to thin the paint out. And then at this point, what I'll do is I'll let this background dry, and once it's dry, I'll then start working into it with thicker oil paint using my palette knife or any other mark making materials. Bits of cardboard are really useful, and even working with your fingers in the oil paint, you can produce some really lovely marks as well, which is something I've been exploring more recently. So we've got our background, and you can see that I've painted right over the edges of the masking tape, so that eventually when I peel these masking tape bits away, we'll be left with a nice crisp line for the work, and I'll then trim that work down and get it framed looking beautiful. Now, for the sake of this video, I'm going to continue working on the wet oil paint so that you can see the sort of techniques that I'll be working with next. But whereas normally I would keep this to dry for a little bit longer. Now, I'm going to use my trusty oil palette, palette knife, and at this point I'm going to start thinking about where the horizon line is going to be, and also where the water's edge is going to be, and I'm going to start adding in details now, and I might even consider working with slightly different colours. So for example, I've got this really lovely purple, and what I'll do is I'll just put a little bit of it on the end of my palette knife here, and then I'm going to start using the palette knife, and I'm just going to delicately start introducing the pink into the edge of the water on my work. And yesterday when I was at Penrose, the waves were absolutely massive, and I might incorporate some of that in here as well. And you might notice that I do always keep looking up at my pictures too, so that I'm working from a reference point. And you can see that I'm starting to just spread the paint with the palette knife. I'm not being too precious about it. That's the other really important thing, to just relax and go with the flow. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. There's so many paintings that I've produced that people have never seen because I might not be happy with them, and I'm sure there's lots of artists out there that do exactly the same. Now, I know for the way that I work in my mark making, I like to have lots of lines in the work. I see a lot of lines in nature and in the sky, and so I'm going to start bringing those things into the work now as well. So what I'll do is I'll wipe my palette knife down, and I'm going to start putting in a little bit more white into the background here. And sometimes it's nice to leave a little bit of like mystery for the viewer. They can decide for themselves where the horizon line is, perhaps. Sometimes you want to make it really evident where it is in your work, and it completely depends on how you feel, on the image that you're working with, on the landscape that you've experienced. And so this is where we're at now. Okay, very abstract. So at this point, I might start thinking about using my brush again, but a smaller brush this time, and I will put it in the oil. And I often just use recycled glass jars to hold the oil and the white spirit, because it's recycling, and then also you can put the lids on in the jars and they can be kept for longer without them drying out. Now what I'm going to do, and I'm hoping you can see this in the video, is I'm then going to start working with my paintbrush after the use of the palette knife. So it's almost like a sandwich effect. We've got the brush, the palette knife, and then the brush again. And then the last few details I might use the palette knife one more time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start going backwards and forwards with my paintbrush and side to side, upwards, downwards and side to side. And I'm actually just going to get a little bit of black paint as well. Lamp black is another really good colour to work with when oil painting, especially if you like your moodier works, which I do. And you might at that point be starting to introduce other tones, other colours into the work, and just starting to add in little bits of detail. Now the weather for me is a real inspiration, and the clouds, the way that the rain falls down in lines, it just completely fascinates me, and I like to try and capture that in my work. Now when washing my brush to use a different colour, I always use the white spirit, and you can probably hear I've got quite a few brushes in there that still need washing. And now I'm going to start mixing some of my colours, and I'm going to start bringing in those horizontal lines in my water's edge, and starting to work out where that horizon line is going to creep in. Okay, it might be that you don't have a horizon line in your landscape, that's fine. But for me, it's quite an important part of my process, thinking about the horizon line, where the land meets the sea, where the sea meets the sky. And at this point, I'm going to put my brush down, and I'm going to start just using my fingers to blend some of the paint as well. And this is a technique that I've been using recently, and I'm just getting some really interesting outcomes with it that I've never come up with before. And it creates a really interesting contrast to those areas where the oil paint is really built up, because it's more of a smudging with the oil paint is what I've noticed. And I might just even just dip my finger into the oil paint and blend it with my finger. And you can get some really interesting dark and light areas as well. And the other thing is that sometimes to just let go of control of where the paint's going and how it's looking every second of whilst you're painting, you know, it's quite exciting. And that's how I think you get a lot of movement in the work, and you're not restricting yourself. But that's just my opinion. Now, what I'm going to do next is I'm going to start bringing in this sort of sandy colour again. And I'm using my finger, and I'm thinking a little bit more white. And then it's quite important that I let this dry before I move into adding in the details of the landscape, of the sea, the movement that I saw, and any additional contrasting colours that I might want to add in. So we've got a real variation now of things happening. We've got a build up of the oil paint. We've also got this sort of smudged effect where the colours are being blended together. And we've also got a bit of a horizon line coming through. And if I show you, this is where we're at now. Okay. Now, what I might do before I let this dry is I might go back to my palette knife again. And of course, this painting is sort of a lot quicker than I'd normally work. I can sometimes spend weeks on a painting this size. I can sometimes spend hours on simply just adding details, but for the purposes of this video, I'm going quite quickly and not making too many decisions. Okay, and I'll spend a lot of time looking at the pictures in advance of producing the work. Now, what I'm going to try and do with my palette knife again is I'm going to start introducing movement into the work. And looking at my pictures, I've been including a lot of curves as well lately. So I might look at sort of scratching into the paint some curves, and also thinking about where the water would hit the land. And again, where there's going to be white water, possibly along the horizon too. So it's a combination of working with the palette knife, the brushes, other mark making materials. For example, I haven't even used this yet. Sometimes I just bring things and I'll experiment and explore with different techniques and different ways of working. And it's about playing. You've got to be playful with paint, with the process, and just not worry too much about the final outcome. And then there'll be times where you're really happy with it, and then there'll be times where you're not as happy, and that is quite common for me. So a little bit of an insight to my working processes. Now, I'm going to let this one dry, and I will, once it's dry, continue to work into it, sign it, trim it down, peel away the masking tape. In fact, I'll do that now so you can see how the masking tape works in producing those edges, those nice neat edges. It's actually quite satisfying as well to peel away those edges. But I wouldn't normally do this until the work is dry, so it's not to smudge anything. And then I would trim the work down, and there you have it, an abstract landscape. Now, of course, this needs a lot more work, and I would continue to work into it maybe once it's completely dry, even with things like oil pastels or charcoal or graphite, or even just normal pencil, to get some darker lines in there, some smudging, some blending, etc. But hopefully you found that useful, and like I say, it's a bit of an insight to my working processes and techniques. And please donate if you can to the Trussell Trust. Thank you so much. Bye.